Okay, well, time to dive into the menu system. And this is where a lot of, excuse me, where a lot of features are kind of buried in here. Some of the more important ones you can get in a more easily accessible place, sometimes on the info screen on the back, or we can program some of the buttons. But this is where a lot of the features are buried in here. So what we're going to have to do is make sure your cameras are turned on, and if you hit the menu button, it's going to take us into the menu. And you'll notice that there's a bunch of symbols over on the left-hand side, and each of these is how we are organizing our different features. The first one is the playback menu, holding all the features that deal with playback, and then we have the shooting menu, the custom menu, and these are just a wide grouping of little features that we can turn on and off depending on how we like to have the camera set up. We have a further setup menu. Our retouch menu, this is one of the areas that we're not going to be spending much time, as this is an area that would be a big use to somebody who didn't own a computer. We'll have a recent settings and my menu, which is actually my favorite of the group. And then at the very bottom, you will see a question mark down there. And this is a very good time if you want to press the question button over on the left-hand side, which doubles as the white balance and protect button. It'll pull up more information about whatever setting that we are currently in. And so anytime you want help figuring something out on the camera when you're in the menu system, hit that question button and you're likely to get more information, and hopefully it'll make it clear for you. So when you get into the menu system and the different icons on the left are activated, you'll see that they turn yellow and you can scroll up and down. You may need to go left or right on that touchpad in the back to make sure that that's active. And then as you get into it, they'll turn black. So we're going to start up here in the playback menu, and we're basically just going to go down line by line and talk about what different things do in the menu system. So first off, the delete button. This is essentially a duplicate of the garbage can button right beside the play button. And if you want to go into this delete button, you can delete individual images, you can delete groups of images by date or by folder. For the most part, I would leave most deleting to something you would do in the post-processing in the computer. But if you want to delete images just real quickly, I would also probably just use the garbage can button. It's just a little bit faster to get to it. But if you want to get to it in here, you can. Next up is playback folder. And if it is not listed as all on the right-hand side, tab to the right and select all in there. In this camera, when you put a memory card in, it will make a D7000 folder on the card. But let's say you have another camera. You have the older D80 or D90, and you shoot pictures with that. There may be a folder on that called a D90. And if you have all playback folders selected, you can see all the images on your card. You will see in here in a moment where we can create different folders. You could have a folder for business and a folder for personal use and have images in separate folders. And if you only wanted to view certain images, you could do that by selecting which playback folder you're going to be looking at. The hide image, if you want to hide an image in the playback mode but you don't want to delete it, you could do that by selecting it in here. You could select an individual image, a group of images, all images on a particular date, for instance. The display mode. In here, if you want to dive into the display mode, there's a number of things that you can check off. There's boxes that you can go in and check off. And in general, if this is my camera, I would probably check all those boxes off because it's optional information that you can pull up if you want it. Now, one of the things that you can pull up is the highlights. And I'm going to show you a little graphic example of what the highlights do. In a picture where you have overexposed certain pixels, the hot pixels, the blown out pixels, will blink at you between white and black. And it's a good indicator to let you know what area has gone overexposed. In general, it's kind of a warning that you may have a wrong exposure. There are certain types of photograph that are very high key and they're going to have a lot of blown out pixels, and in that case you don't need to worry about this. But for general picture taking, it's a nice little warning that you've overexposed the image. Next up is the copy image, and if you want to make a duplicate copy of an image on the memory card, you can do that. And you can also copy from one card to the next. Image review, for the most part I would leave this on. This is something that you would leave on so that you could see the image after you've taken it. If you're going to do something like a interval time shooting, which is something we'll reach upon later on, if you're trying to save battery power, that'd be another reason you could turn it off to help save battery power so you don't waste a little bit of energy. After delete is just a little custom function. What happens after you delete an image? Does it go back to the previous image? Does it go to the image that you were headed towards? You can customize that as needed there. Rotate tall. Now, as we go through these features, I will occasionally give you my recommendations, especially when I think they're different than what they are set at. And on this one, I would make sure that you have this rotate tall turned off. I'm not sure where it is on your camera, but I would turn it off. And that way, when you take a vertical picture, it'll use as much space on the back of the camera as possible. It'll still rotate it. Actually, it's controlled someplace else, but it can still rotate it in the computer, which is a very handy feature, but it won't rotate it on the back of the camera. After that, we have a slideshow mode that we're not going to get into, but if you wanted to hook this up to a TV and have a slideshow, you can set the timing and which images you will show. The same thing with print set. We're not going to get into that in this class. If you didn't have a computer for setting this up on printing, this would select what images you want printed, how you want them printed. It uses the standard DPOF print language, essentially, so that it can hook up to a lot of printers directly and send them files for printing. All right, next up, we're going to go to the shooting menu, so you need to tab back over to the left and go down to the camera icon, and then back to the right. Reset shooting options. If you have been playing around in your camera like you are about to do, and you want to reset everything back to the factory defaults, you can do it here. The storage folder, we talked earlier about which folder you were using to look at images. This is where you can select and create unique folders. So for instance, if somebody wants you to shoot pictures for them and you want to shoot all of those images onto one folder that you can easily transfer, you can set that folder up right here and give it a name and have it designated. That's where all your images are going to be put. File naming. Your camera has standard file naming protocol that it gives on all its images. If you want to go in and adjust the 3-letter code, you could put your 3-letter initials in there so that anytime your file comes out of your camera, it's got your initials on it. There are additional ways to put your name and your copyright information, but this is yet another way to add your stamp onto your photographs. Role played by card in slot 2. You'll see in here you have the option of overflow. So if you just want to continuously fill up both cards, fill up one and then the next. Backup, where the information gets written to both cards simultaneously, or you can select where RAW images and JPEG images are shot. Now you can also shoot stills and movies, but that is selected in a different area in the menu that we will get to. Image quality. This is accessible by a couple of other routes on the outside of the camera, but you can get into here and change it from RAW to JPEG. Now you can also change the type of JPEGs that you get. And along with that, we have another couple of settings that are all closely related. We have the image size. We talked a little bit about this before, which is the number of pixels that you are recording. If you do choose to record in JPEG format, I would generally choose the largest size so that you have the most data to work with. If you're downloading to a computer, you're working with a program like Lightroom, you can crop in later and get good quality results. We have JPEG compression. The confusing thing to me, and I would love to talk to somebody very high up in the technical department at Nikon, is that up in image quality, we have different JPEGs that we can choose, fine, normal, and basic, which is a compression setting, but we can choose compression setting again down here, and they are both compressing it, but I believe in slightly different ways. Now, how much should you compress your images? Well, in general, you want to leave them as uncompressed as possible so that you get as much detail out of them. If you shoot RAW, this doesn't matter. This is only applying to people who are shooting JPEG. If you are shooting JPEG, I recommend large, fine quality. This final 7th JPEG compression, there is a size priority or optimal quality. I would leave it at optimal quality so you get the best quality images possible. Next up, we have NEF recording. And so in here, we have a couple different recording types as for the raw image. We have a lossless compressed and a compressed. And we're not going to focus on this too long. The pixel peepers in the crowd will be more than happy to talk about this for the next couple hours. If you put it in compressed, it's going to reduce the file size a little bit and make the camera operate a little bit more quickly in its shot-to-shot framing and how many shots you can get in the buffer. I have seen test results where I could not see a noticeable difference between these two. And so if you want your camera to shoot a little bit faster, I would go with compressed. If you want your camera to get as much data as possible, I would put it in the lossless compressed. And along in there is the bit depth. This is recording how many colors you are recording. You have the choice of either 16 million colors, which is pretty good, or 268 million colors, even more. This is kind of like the recording of lossless versus compressed. If you put it into 14-bit, the camera will record as much data as possible, but it will slow the camera down in its motor drive a little bit. If you're shooting sports and frame-to-frame, speed is important to you. I would set this at 12-bit. If you are concerned about getting every last ounce of quality out of that image, you can put it at 14-bit. I have seen tests between the two, and very small to no difference at all in what I've seen with today's software. Now, they may come up with software in 2 to 3 years that sees more of a difference, but it is a very small difference in any case. Next up, white balance. Now, we have hit white balance in other places, so I don't need to talk about it too much here. We do have a couple of auto modes. If you go into the auto mode, you can start customizing this, as well as customizing many of the other modes. And there is additional ways to get in and say, I don't like the incandescent setting on it. I want it to be more blue, more orange, more yellow. And so it's got an infinite amount of customizing. Most people really don't need to do this. If you shoot RAW, you don't need to do it at all because RAW records all the straight data anyway. And so that's another good reason for shooting RAW besides good image quality otherwise. All right, so below the white balance, we have set picture control. This is important if you are shooting JPEGs. If you're shooting RAW, it is not important. But this affects the color, contrast, saturation of your images. You can go in and you can select different settings that are already set up for you, or you can create your own. And this is something that you really don't need to do if you're going to play around with your images on the computer, because you can do it later on the computer, I think, with much better results, because you have much better feedback knowing that you're looking at a color-corrected screen, and it's a lot easier to work with on a standard computer. Next up, we have Manage Picture Control, and this is where we can go in and customize modes. If you want to set a particular sharpening, contrast, brightness, saturation setting for a group of images, you can do this. Once again, if you use a nice program like Lightroom or Photoshop, you don't really need to do this at all. If you want to control it all on the camera, this is where you do it. Auto distortion control. This camera has a lot of things where it's communicating back and forth with the lens, and this is one of the areas that the camera may have problems communicating with a non-Nikon lens. In this case, this is one of the things that you might want to turn on. Here's a little picture example of a situation where I was using a very wide-angle lens, and there's a little bit of distortion. You can see that the horizon line is slightly curved, and it's not because the Earth is round. In this case, it is simply because the lens did not record it round. So you can correct for that, and I will just go back and forth between these two and have the camera automatically fix that distortion control. And so all lenses have some distortion. Some is just more noticeable than others. And so on this one, I would kind of hesitate to say leaving it on to fix that within the lenses. It can be done later, but Nikon knows how distorted their lenses are, because as I say, all lenses have some distortion, and it is a good way to kind of fix it right out of the gate. And there's not too many people who like the distortion in their lens. And if they do, they can buy a fisheye lens. Next up, color space. And in this one, I would recommend going in and changing it to Adobe RGB. Adobe RGB is a wider color gamut than sRGB, and if you want to submit images to magazines and so forth, they prefer that you shoot in the widest gamut of colors so that you have the largest palette to choose from. And so that is one that I would change. The active D-lighting. In my camera, it is off, and I believe that's the way it is normally when you get your camera. And let's take a look at an example of what is going on in active D-lighting. What is happening in active D-lighting is it's trying to accommodate for situations where the brightness and the shadows are far apart. And so in this particular situation, the shadows are kind of dark. If we use active D-lighting, it's going to lighten up what's in the shadows. And let's compare the kind of before and after. And in this particular case, I like it on. But I would hesitate turning it on all the time because some images, I think, look better with it off. And so this is something that can be fixed later in software. So I would probably leave this off or on one of the lower settings. Perhaps I probably wouldn't put it on extra high unless you were in a very unusual situation. But if it was my camera, I'd probably leave it off and leave it up to post software to handle it and do a better job at it. Next up, let's see, what are we going to? Long exposure noise reduction and high ISO noise reduction. These are both kind of two of the same thing. We talked earlier about setting your ISO on your camera. Low ISOs, you get less noise. High ISO, you're going to get more noise. There is built-in software in the camera that can help reduce that. However, some cameras' built-in software actually make it worse. It depends on the situation, the image, and the noise reduction and the level that it is set. And so you may want to do some tests on your own to see if this is something that you want to use. There is post-processing noise reduction software out there, so this is something that can be done outside of the camera. It is something that I would generally leave turned off. It can also slow your camera down in your frame-to-frame shot speed if you have this turned on and you're under very low light conditions. And it's something that you may want to turn on from time to time. But once again, I would do a little checking into it and testing on your own to see if it's something that's important to you. Next up, we have our ISO sensitivity, and this is something that is more easily accessed by the ISO button on the back of the camera, but we can get in here and do it as well. Multiple exposures. This camera can shoot 2 or 3 pictures onto the same frame, essentially. Once again, this is in lieu of Photoshop. You can't do this in Lightroom, and so if you want to take 2 pictures and take them on top of each other, you can do it in this camera. I would much rather work it in Photoshop because I would have much, much better control of it, but this camera does give you that option to do it. The movie setting. If we go into the movie setting, you have a number of movie modes in here. The first off is the quality size, so you can go in and choose your frame rates and choose the size of recording that you're getting, full HD, HD, or one of the smaller ones. You can control the microphone. You can turn the microphone off or change the sensitivity of it. You can choose the destination card. If you have 2 cards in your camera, you can select the second card for movies rather than the first card. And then if you want to manually control shutter speeds and apertures, you can go into the manual movie settings and you can turn that on so you can select your own particular shutter speeds and apertures, which if you're going to shoot a lot of videos and you're really into it, I would probably keep that in the manual mode so you can make those adjustments. Next up is the interval timer shooting, and this is a fun little feature. I'm really glad that Nikon has built this into the camera. And let me show you a couple of intervalometer shots that I have taken. This is on Lake Union here in Seattle. This is the Duck Dodge. And what I did is I took a picture about every 10 seconds for about an hour. And actually you're going to see here, this is about 45 minutes compressed down to about 15 seconds. And so it can take a large amount of time and compress it down. Take a look at another one. This is from the desert down in Mexico, Baja, Mexico. Each exposure is a 30-second exposure of the stars moving. It's going to get dark here in a moment, and that is the moon setting. And we'll be able to see the stars even better. And then we've got one more. This is my favorite one. This is in Varanasi, India. It's a very busy, crowded street system there. And just watch some of these yellow buses coming in at the right here in just a moment, trying to cross this crowded street. Just so many people packed on it. It's just hard for them to get around. And so this is about an hour compressed into, once again, about 15 seconds. And so you can do this all in here. I'm not going to go into exactly how you set it all, but basically you set the number of shots, you set the distance between the shots, you can even set how many shots it takes at each interval. But it's a lot of fun, and it's a great way to shoot movies in a different way with a still camera. And that was the interval timer shooter. Next up is the remote control mode. When you use a remote control, you can control whether there is a 2-second delay, whether it fires the shutter immediately, or whether it activates the mirror up mode on the camera. I think on that one I would leave it either at 2 or 10 seconds. Probably 2 seconds is the most common one. Next up, we are going to be going into the custom setting menu, and this is where we're going to split things up and have a lot of different choices as we get into this. And so first off, we're going to be in the A section for autofocus, and let's enter into that. And we have a number of things to look at in here. The first thing is AFC priority selection. When the camera is in AFC, which is the continuous focusing, or kind of the sports mode of the camera will take a picture anytime you press the button. It won't check to see if your subject is in focus first. It's got what's called release priority, and you can change that around so that it doesn't take a picture until it is in focus. When you get into sports photography, this may become an important mode to have it turned on or off. And just the opposite is true in the S focusing mode, which is single focus. Generally, the camera will focus on one single object, and it won't fire the shutter until it's in focus. And generally, I wouldn't change these first two until you've determined that you need to change it for the way you work. Focus tracking with lock on. This one is once again for sports photographers. You can change exactly how the camera reassesses focusing on the focusing points. And this is something that you may need to change depending on the type of sports that you're photographing. For instance, basketball and auto racing may have very different requirements, the way subjects come in and out of focus and the way they get interfered with other objects that may get in your way. In general, I wouldn't change anything if you're not doing a lot of sports. If you do get into sports, you can look more closely into those modes. AF point illumination. On this one, inside the viewfinder, the focus points will automatically light up when it's dark, which I think is a fairly convenient thing. If you like them a lot, you can turn them on all the time, or if you don't like things popping up in front of you, you can turn them off all the time. Well, for the most part, I would just leave it in auto. Focus point wraparound. I definitely like the wrap, so I would turn the wrap on. Basically, what's going on here is you have all these focus points, and when you go all the way over to the right, and you press right again, it flips around to the left side. So it just wraps around back to the left side. So you can more easily get from one spot to the other. The number of focus points, let's see what we have here. You can choose either 39 or 11 points. For the most part, I would leave it at 39 points, but you may find situations that you think that's too many points for the type of subjects that you're pointed at. You can customize it. The built-in autofocus illuminator. We talked about this little light on the front of the camera that turns on under low light conditions. If you are going to be photographing maybe a speaker, or you don't want other people to see that you're about to take a picture under low light conditions, you could turn this off. I call this the stealth paparazzi mode. So you aren't notifying everybody that you're about to take a picture. Next up, what do we have? We have the live view movie AF. Let's see, what are our options in here? This is where you can control the focus mode and the autofocus area, and this is more easily changed in the information panel, so I really wouldn't bother changing it here. Back out of that. And what do we have next? All right, so now we're going to get into the metering and exposure section. So B1, ISO sensitivity step value. You can change the settings from third to half stop. I like third stops, just a little more accurate. And the same thing for the exposure value steps. You can change that to half steps if you want. Sometimes there's light meters or other cameras or devices that work in half stops rather than third stops, and you may want to keep this kind of synchronized with the other devices you're working with. Easy exposure compensation. And on this one, it's normally off, which is where I would leave it. If you have it on, what it does is it Normally to do exposure compensation, you have to press a button and turn a dial. If you turn it on, you don't have to press that button. You just turn the dial on it. And for some people, it turns just a little too easily.
Lightning.
Something we don't get very often here in
really
Seattle.
don't.
So we're sitting in the middle of just tons of electronics, and we're having a bit of a lightning storm here in Seattle right now.
Yeah, we don't usually get electrical storms here. But.
So, yeah, it's uncommon for us. Continuing on, the center weighted area. We talked about being able to customize the metering patterns. If the center weighted area is something different than you want, you can go in and customize it. I wouldn't normally change it, but you can always do this. Fine-tune optimal exposure, B5. If you find that your camera is constantly overexposing or underexposing, in the past you would have to send the camera back to the manufacturer to have them tweak the exposure. In here, you can tweak it yourself. And so if you want to bump it up or bump it down, you can go in and do that. I wouldn't do it unless you know what you're doing and you know that it's consistently off in one direction. Next up, we're going into the C section for timers and auto exposure lock. Here's where we get to customize a number of things. The first one is your shutter release button, the AEL button, the auto exposure lock button. You can turn that on so that when you press the button, it locks the exposure in. We can also customize this button for something else, so there's some other things that I think are important that may be used for doing that. Auto meter off delay, this is what we went in earlier today and adjusted to a longer period of time. As we're getting closer to the end of class, if you want to adjust it back, you can change the time length that the meter stays on. Generally, you want it long enough so that it's convenient to work with but doesn't waste battery power. So whatever that common middle ground is for you. I think 6 seconds was kind of the standard and is not a bad one to have. The self-timer allows you to go in and customize how long the self-timer will take before it takes a picture. 2, 5, 10, 20 seconds, and then how many pictures will it take once you take a picture. I found that if you do a group shot, sometimes 10 seconds isn't enough if you're a long ways from the camera or there's a lot of people that need to get organized. And then if there are a lot of people, I'd highly recommend shooting like 3 or 4 shots. That way you can avoid people blinking and looking away, and you can probably get one good one out of a bunch of them, and that way you don't have to run back to the camera to set the camera up. Next up is monitor off delay. This is basically how long you want the monitor to stay on, and set it to your liking. See if there's anything else in there. You can go in and you can individually select different things: playback menus, information display, image review, and live view. So you can customize between each one of those how long you think they should stay on. As a factory default, they're pretty good to start with, but that's where you change them if you need be. Remote on duration. When you are using a remote control, how long do you want the camera to stay active? If you're putting the camera in a remote location and you press down on the shutter release, that's going to wake the camera up, but it may not fire it unless the camera is awake. And so you may want to leave the camera awake for a longer period of time if you have a remote hooked up in some situations. Next up, we're down at the blue Ds, which is shooting and display information. All right, so here's one that I definitely like to change. Go into the beep and turn that thing off. I get tired of listening to people's camera come into focus and self-timer beeping at you. So if you want to be a little bit more quiet and make less of a nuisance of yourself, you can turn that off. Viewfinder grid display. We talked about the viewfinder has an optional grid that you can turn on. This is where you do that. ISO display and adjustment. And one of the things that I don't like about this camera is that natively, as you look through the viewfinder, it doesn't show you your ISO. But you can change that by going in and show ISO sensitivity, and it will show you the ISO sensitivity. The problem is that you have to choose what's most important, your ISO or the number of pictures left. And they're both pretty important numbers. And so you can choose on it. If you do have it set as standard, it'll show you the number of pictures, and when you press ISO, it will then show you the ISO button. And so it's a choice on which one is the lesser of two evils there. Viewfinder warning display. If you want to have those little warning indicators turned on or off, like the black and white, the memory card, and the battery, you can have that information there. If you don't like it, get rid of it. Screen tips. I would generally leave this on, especially if you're new to the camera. When you press the info button, there's little tool tips that come up indicating what those features do. And so I would leave that turned on while you're learning the camera, and maybe as you get more advanced you can turn that one off. The CL mode shooting speed. This is the continuous low shooting speed. It, I think, is normally set at 3 frames per second, which is pretty good. But if you want to be more specific about it, you want to slow it down or speed it up, you can do that. Remember, the high-speed continuous is shooting at 6 frames a second. So wherever it is that you want in there. The max continuous release, how many images do you want the camera to be able to shoot in one release of the camera? For most people, it's not a big deal with memory cards. You can just keep shooting away. But for some people, maybe they want to put a little bit more of a restriction. They only want to shoot 2 or 3 pictures at a time. You can set that in here. Moving on to D8, file number sequence. On this one, I would make sure that it says on. It is a continuous cycling system that will continually add numbers up. It starts at 0001 and goes up to 10,000. But as a warning, it will go back down to 0001 after you've hit 10,000. And so the camera will go through 10,000 pictures and then start renumbering them. And this is why I think it's good practice in software, Lightroom, Photoshop, etc., to rename your files once you get them in your computer so that you don't end up with files with the same number on them. Information display. On this one, you can go in and customize the brightness of the display. You can also, let's see, what else can you do here? Information display. You can also set it manually, and you can also change the color of it, the way the information panel on the back shows. I think the standard system is all right on it, but you can go in and customize the dark on light or light on dark option of it. The LCD illumination is the next one, and on this one, you can, what happens is that if you turn it on, the LCD switch around your shutter release will activate the LCD in the back of the camera. Some people might like that, some people might not like it, because normally you would just press the info button to turn it on. Exposure delay mode. This is if you're going to be using mirror lockup. It delays the shutter release by 1 second. It helps leave enough time for when the mirror comes up to dampen out any vibrations. If you're going to shoot a lot of copy work where it's on a copy stand, you're at a critical shutter speed where you might get some mirror vibration, you could set that. Most people will never use this mode. And next up, we have our flash warning. There's an indicator in the viewfinder that'll blink at you if you need flash. If you don't like that, you can turn it off. The MD11, which is the vertical grip for this, you can indicate what type of batteries you are using in there. It needs to know for power consumption and what type of battery is being used. The battery order, there's a battery in the camera, and then there's a battery in the vertical grip, and you can decide which battery gets used first for whatever reason you might need. Not sure what that would be, but you can decide it. Once we get through these customs, we'll take a break and go for some questions at the end of this, but we'll just go ahead and finish this E section here, which is bracketing and flash. So flash sync speed, you can select what's the maximum shutter speed or what shutter speeds you can use with flash. And I would leave it at 1/250th of a second. You could adjust it if necessary, but 1/250th is the maximum shutter speed that the camera will allow, so why not let it do it? And then in flash shutter speed, what are we doing here? Got to remember this. In some of the automatic modes, what will the camera allow? So if you set your camera in aperture priority and it needs the flash, will it just stay at 60th of a second? Or will you allow it to go down to a slower shutter speed? And this is really going to depend on how confident you are in working with slow shutter speeds in flash. If you're not sure what you're doing, I would probably leave it at a 60th of a second. If you feel more confident that you have good control over low light and working with the flash, you might go down to a 15th or an 1/8 of a second, or as much as 30 seconds, depending on how you like to use your camera. And then we have flash control for the built-in flash. The built-in flash is an automatic flash. It's going to figure out how much light you need. And we looked at our flash exposure compensation so we can power it down if we want. But in here, we can actually go in and set it manually if we want. We can also do a repeating flash, and we can do a commander mode where we hook this up to another flash unit, which is a whole nother class unto itself, and working with remote flashes. So it's very capable, but this is how you get to it. Modeling flash. Modeling flash here is something that you can turn on or off. This is an option that the built-in flash will fire very quickly. It looks like a strobe light going off very, very quickly, and allows you to see where the shadows are going to be when the flash actually does fire. And it's activated with the mirror lockup button. Auto bracketing set. You can choose what you are shooting when you do an auto bracketing. You can choose auto exposure and flash, auto exposure only flash, white balance bracketing, or active delighting in there. And so most people are going to leave this on the first option, AE and flash. Not something most people are going to choose. The bracketing order, we had a question earlier about changing the bracketing order. Normally it'll shoot the metered setting first, and then the under, and then the over, but you can do under, metered, and then over, whatever your choice. Actually, we got one more set to go through before we'll go to questions on this. We'll go down and do the final controls on this. And so first up is the LCD illuminator switch. And I think I may have misspoken on an earlier one, because this is what I was thinking of. When you activate this one, it turns on the information screen on the back as well as the light on the top LCD panel. Next up is the OK button. Normally it will reset the focusing point to the center. Remember, this little touchpad in the back controls the focusing in normal shooting modes. By pressing the OK, it gets you back to the center point. You can customize how that is assigned right there. You can just have it highlight the active point to show you where it's at. F3, this is how we get to start assigning features to our camera. The function button, which if you recall is this little button right up here on the lens, next to the lens of the camera, right where your forefinger might be. It says FN on it, and you can assign what feature goes in there. And there's about 19 different features that you can put in there. Of the ones that I've seen that I kind of like either spot metering, grid, or virtual horizon. I think those are three kind of neat options to set in there to reassign that button. The next is the assign preview button. The preview button is just below that, kind of on the bottom of your camera, right below the lens. It's unlabeled, just a plain old black button. Normally it's going to do depth of field preview, which is probably where I would leave it. But if you don't like that, you find something else more useful, by all means, go in and change it. And then the AEL and AFL button on the back of the camera, that too can be changed. And I would leave it either as the AF lock button, or you might want to try it as the AF on button so that you can focus your lens by pressing that button in the back, which gives you a different option for focusing rather than the shutter release in front. Next up, we have F6, customize command dials. If you don't like the way the dials turn, you can reverse them. If you don't like the main command and the sub command and you want to reverse them, you can switch what the dials do. You can get in on the aperture setting, and you can actually change that on the aperture ring if you want to. So you can customize a lot of the way the buttons and dials work, and this is just one of those areas to do that. Let's see, what do we have next? Release button to use dial. Let me try to remember this one. I got to look at my notes on this one. Normally, when you want to change one of the features on the back, white balance, ISO, or quality, you would press that button, leave your finger on the button, and turn a dial. If you want to go in and turn this on, basically what you would do is you would press the button, it would stay active, you don't have to keep your finger on the button then, and you would turn a dial. Most people aren't going to worry about this, but if you do want to adjust the way those buttons work, you can do it here. Slot empty release. This basically prevents you from taking pictures, or at least thinking you're taking pictures, when there's no memory card in the camera. And so normally it's locked and you can't fire the shutter with no memory card in there, so I would leave it where it's normally at, leave it at locked. Reverse indicators, we mentioned in the viewfinder, if you don't like the direction that the plus and minus buttons are on, you can reverse that here. And then you can assign the features to the buttons on the MD11 vertical grip, so you can customize that as well. And so that takes us through the custom menu. Before we jump into the setup menu, we'll go ahead and pause and see if we have some questions on all of those little features.
You want to see if we have some questions, John?
Is there anybody out there that has a question?
Yes, there are many
Okay,
people.
I didn't say I want to hear the questions. I just want to know if there are questions.
Yes, there's quite a few questions.
There's questions.
I would
We
love
may
to
not
take
answer
questions.
the questions.
I have a couple people were curious about your scenes from Varanasi.
Yes.
As Factor had asked, did you manually zoom out, or is that a programmable setting?
That's a very observant. Good question. No. Here's one of the reasons for time-lapse shooting, which goes into a whole other area, but if you do want to shoot time-lapse, a good thing to do is to shoot large JPEGs, because it is way overkill for HD TV, and you can start zoomed in Final Cut Pro and zoom back. So I'd never move the lens. And I simply did that zooming afterwards, and there was more than enough resolution in Final Cut Pro to do that. And so one reason to shoot large JPEGs. And the other things for shooting in intervalometer series is manual focus and manual shutter speeds and aperture. Set everything up manually so that nothing changes from shot to shot.
Great, thank you. Oh,
We have
comment
a
from the audience.
In-house comment?
Yeah, I did a time lapse on this camera and I shot it in JPEGs, and various shots of the JPEGs were different stop exposures. It was really strange. But
What
when
was
I
causing that? Was that,
I have
what
no
mode? Were you
idea.
in manual mode or?
I was in manual mode. Everything was manual.
That
So
doesn't make sense
shooting
then.
JPEGs, it was kind of weird, but when I shot RAW, everything was perfect.
Have you been able to go back to the metadata and see if your has it listed different shutter speed or different aperture?
As far as I could tell, I mean, everything looked like all the exposures were the same. And it was really strange because it was just every now and then there was a shot that was a little brighter than the next, and I had to go back and manually adjust each frame to make it look the same.
Oh, really?
So I would suggest shooting RAW if you can afford to have that much.
Yeah,
disk
I've
space.
heard some people recommend shooting RAW. The problem with RAW is that you're going to then have to convert hundreds and hundreds of images to JPEG. And while I like RAW images for their better quality, HD TV, as great as it isn't anywhere close to what this camera can shoot on still images. And so you're just not going to be able to take advantage of the wider color space or the extra pixels. And so you don't
It's
need
at least
it.
something to watch out for. 'Cause
Yeah.
that's what I experienced.
And you had that on a D7000?
Yeah, on this camera.
Interesting. Okay, so something to be aware of. Thanks.
New York had asked, if you go from the 39 focus points down to the 9 points, does the focus speed increase, i.e. in sports setting or in panning shots?
I think that totally depends on exactly what you're focused on and how it's working. The 9 points that you're using are all the really good points. If you have the 39 points, generally what's going to happen is that you have this large area in front of you, and it's using all the points to try to focus on something, and basically it's going to hit it's going to focus on the first solid object it hits, so whatever's closest to you. So if something is fairly close over there on the far left-hand side, that's what it's going to try to grab. And those focus points are not as good as the ones in the center. And so I would think that you might get slightly higher performance from the center brackets. But your subject is going to have to be in the center of the frame. And you're maybe not going to be as versatile as far as the composition of where your subject is. And so all sports are uniquely different, whether you're shooting track and field, or football, or soccer, or auto racing, or birds flying, or lions running. Just the types of movement that they have, how they fill the frame, your angle of view, your lens. That's why there's so many customizations on the focusing system, from brackets and how quickly it changes focusing points and so forth.
You might be one of the few photographers in the room who have actually photographed lions running.
I have photographed lions laying down in the field, not running.
Okay.
But tigers.
Close enough,
Close
John,
enough,
close enough.
yeah.
So trips to the Seattle Zoo don't count then. A question about aperture priority, that you can only sync at 1/60th of a second, not at 1/250th, which it should,
Well,
that shouldn't, in aperture priority,
let me
that
go ahead and
shouldn't
put this camera
change.
in aperture priority. And just kind of as natural, my camera is at a 60th of a second right now. And in aperture priority, I can change the aperture, but I can't change the shutter speed. And it's
Okay.
because we have that customized setting at 1/60th of a second. The camera would like to shoot at a slower shutter speed, but that's kind of a good general, I would call it, don't mean to disparage anybody here, but the mom and pop mode. You know, they're just taking pictures of their kid. They don't want to do a 15-second exposure because they're going to end up with a blurry picture. There could be all sorts of reasons why you do want to do a 15-second exposure and have the flash fire off. But you kind of want to be aware that that's how your camera's set. And so in this aperture priority mode, let me go ahead and pump the ISO up really high and see if I can get it to go there. I pumped it up to 6400. Actually, let me do 3200, and I'm at 1/60th of a second. I can get up to ISO 5000, and now I have a flash sync of 2/50th of a second. So the camera inherently wants to be at a 60th of a second and will only jump up if it absolutely has to.
Unless you throw it into manual and say,
Unless you throw it in the manual
"This is
mode,
what
and
I
then you
wanna
can do basically whatever you want. I still can't go above 2/50th of a second.
for your sync speed.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because the picture would not be evenly exposed. But I can go as slow as I want as well. And so surprisingly, while flash is one of the most complicated areas of photography, if you're going to use flash, manual is a great mode to be in. And so I would recommend it because you can but it's great for all the other things too. And so this is where you can start taking control of all the aspects of your photography.
Yeah, I would concur there as well, as someone who does a lot of stuff with lighting. So off-camera lighting,
It just stays more
manual is a must.
consistent.
Yes. Just a couple of questions I've seen going back and forth. I know it's probably not in the plans for today, but how would you compare the sensor in this camera to like the D300S? I know there's some similarities, and I know that the D300S offers some functionality that this camera wouldn't because
Okay.
it's considered a higher model. But do you know anything about
Well,
that particular sensor in comparison?
I'm going to sidestep it a little bit in that this class is not a comparison class. We're not comparing how this camera compares with another camera. There are other people who are much better suited to testing and comparing cameras. This is mainly designed for people who want to learn how to use this camera, but I realize there's a lot of people out here. As of today, Nikon is in a very strange situation because the D300S, which is the step up from this camera, in some ways has less features. It has less megapixels. There's a number of features that are on this one that are not on the step-up model because the step-up model is kind of on an older camera. And I would expect them to come out with a new version of that camera with all of these benefits even better. And so it's kind of an awkward step right now, which is great for the D7000 sales because a lot of people who might be stepping up are actually getting this camera. And so the sensor in it is really good. I haven't done a side-by-side comparison with the D300S, but I would expect that there's going to be a model after the D300S that is going to have either this sensor or a slightly better sensor in it, as well as being better constructed, better focus, and whatever else better they want to make about it. And so for right now, this is a great buy in comparison with other Nikon cameras because it's the latest technology.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
Sure thing.
KSTAT had asked, there are tons of features on the camera, obviously, and what percentage do you think you would use for 90% of your shooting?
Okay, I'll break it down. Of all the features on the camera, 50% you will never, ever, ever, ever use. 40% you will use once, and 10% you'll use on a regular basis. And when we get down to the end of this, the camera operation, we're going to go through those 10% over and over again so that everyone feels really comfortable with where all those 10 features are on those camera. We're kind of in the midst of going through those things that you'll set once. You know, you like the meter to stay on for 15 seconds rather than 10. That's not something that you're likely to change very often, and those are those ones. And half of the ones that we go through in here, you just don't use. I used to tell people that these cameras are kind of like cable TV. Just because it comes with 200 channels doesn't mean you watch all of them.
Right, I agree. The same thing we were talking about that earlier is like some people read the manual. I don't read the manual. I go to the manual when I need to do something and I don't know how to do it. And there's tons of features on my camera that I probably don't use.
Yeah.
I just want to say I'm really surprised you didn't say there's a slide for that, because of
There-
the exciting keynote slides that are coming up.
Oh, it's,
With
I
the
want to leave them,
important features.
I don't want to
Give it
poke
away.
it too, I don't want to lead into what's going up to,
But I mean,
what's
that's
going
a-
to happen too much.
That's a great question for what's coming up.
Yes, yes.
So I know we're still diving deep into the menus. I believe there's a way to change the stops from increments of a third to half.
We'd actually already passed by that.
Oh, okay.
But, you know, just
we
for
just
kicks, I will go ahead and
do
do
that
that
once more?
live
That
for
would be
the
great.
camera above. On that one, I believe it is in the metering and exposure section. And actually B1 and B2, we can change ISO sensitivities from 1/3 to 1/2 step, and the exposure value from 1/3 to 1/2 step. I know I have an older handheld light meter. I know that makes me sound ancient, but it works in 1/2 stops. And so if I wanted my camera to be synced up with that device, I might change my camera to 1/2 stops.
I'm so used to shooting in thirds, I wouldn't know what to do with myself anymore.
Yeah.
Trademark, he had asked if you could please talk about custom white balance with gray cards, etc.
Custom white balance. We talked about this very briefly in the white balance section, but if you're in a lighting situation that, well, it's funky lighting, it's just weird, and the standard white balance settings don't work, what you can do is you can photograph a white sheet of paper and go into the custom white balance setting of the camera. There will be instructions, and I don't want to go through it all right now, but it will basically a step-by-step procedure where you tell the camera, I'm going to shoot a piece of white paper, and you shoot a piece of white paper, and the camera figures out what sort of color tint is on it, because if it knows it's a white piece of paper, it can see how the sensor is picking it up, and it then corrects for that on future shots. So you do need to be in the custom white balance mode. You then need to calibrate it. And so I would look into your instruction manual to find the details on it. Most people don't do this on a regular basis. If you shoot in RAW, it's not a huge deal. But if you are shooting something that needs to be very precise in color, you're working for a clothing manufacturer or someone who does painting, and the colors have to be as accurate as possible, this is a way for you to get as accurate colors as this camera can produce.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Do you want to take more questions? Because there are a lot more.
Let's take a couple more. You know,
Okay,
we went through a lot of stuff, and there's a lot of little
Okay.
things in here.
kind of related. Have you noticed what the file size is for the raw images on that one?
File sizes are going to be pretty close to 16 megabytes per image,
Okay.
but they do vary. If you shoot a picture of a white wall, it's going to be lower than it is of something that has wildly contrasting colors and shapes and so forth.
Okay, Starbytes would like to know what's the highest ISO recommended on the D7000 until the image looks grainy.
Ooh, that is a subjective question. My general rule of thumb on all cameras, and I'll throw it on this one, is that the highest ISO setting is garbage. The one below that is garbage as well. And the one below that is probably the highest one that I would think about setting on any sort of have-to basis. It's one of those things you always want to keep the ISO as low as possible. But why does it shoot at 25,800, as I like to say? If Elvis and Bigfoot are stepping off the UFO and it's the only way to get the shot, it's better to get that shot than a blurry one. So it's there if you need it, but try to keep it as low as possible.
And what is the third setting on the D7000?
That would put us, goes up to 25, so that's bad, 12's bad. So that would be about 6,400.
Okay.
You know, if you got to get the shot, I have no problem setting it at 6,400. But at that point, you know, it's got to be a
Pushing
really
it.
important shot. You're not shooting it for its beauty. You're shooting it because you need the shot.
Okay. Good to know. Thanks, John. Shasta had asked, is there a lock on the mode dial?
A lock on the mode dial? No. Most cameras do not have a lock. There is a camera or two out there that do, but this one does not. So you do need to be a little bit careful about taking the camera in and out of your camera bag. It can get bumped out of the mode that it's in.
So I've seen one or two questions, I think, about this, and I know personally this doesn't sound like a good idea, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is it true that you can't change the aperture while you're shooting video? Now,
Yeah, we actually had a question here, one of our live students, and so I was running it through a quick test. And if you are shooting video or you're in the live view mode, you cannot change the aperture. However, you can change the aperture before going into live view or before you start shooting your video. And so if you want to set a specific aperture, f16, set it before you go into the live view mode, and then you can select the shutter speed afterwards. I'm not sure what's going on in the electronics. There's nothing wrong with the camera. It's just the way it's designed. But it can be controlled. It's just particular about the way it's controlled. Maybe we'll take one more question and then move on. So find me a good one.
You have a good one, Kate?
I'm reading.
Okay.
Find one that has a really long question but very short in answer so I can rest while you're reading the question.
Have some water.
Okay. I don't know if this is a short answer. Do you have a good one? No. Okay.
I'm totally kidding. Whatever.
My name in the chat room had asked, is there a solution to activating video remotely using either a wireless remote or the IR remote or even tethered shooting with either Lightroom or Nikon Canon Control Pro 2?
Remote activation of the video. You know, I haven't played with all the other software tethered shooting, so I don't know for sure, but I don't think so. About the best I can offer is that this front function button can be reprogrammed to start the recording as opposed to the back button. It's just one of those things. This camera's not designed to shoot video. It's designed to shoot still pictures, and it doesn't have all the right hookups that someone who shoots movies wants it to have. So unless somebody in the chat room can correct me on that, I don't know of any other device that starts the recording without touching the camera. And so that's where you have to edit things later on after the camera's stopped vibrating down. So we're going to go ahead and kind of get back into the menu system here. And we are at the custom setting menu, which is the wrench icon. And the first thing here is the format memory card. Now, whenever you head out on an important shoot, it's good that you have downloaded all the information off your memory card, backed it up, done all that, and that you reformat your memory card before you go out and shoot. This cleans up all the files, all the folders, any problems that are with your card. It cleans up the best it can. And so it's good to reformat the card as opposed to just simply deleting all the images. So reformat, don't delete. Next up, save user settings. Remember the custom one or the user one and user two mode on the top mode dial? Well, you can go set your camera up manually and then register things in here. So what you would do there is just go set the camera up as you wish it to be operated, and then go to save user settings and lock in where you want those set at. If you want to reset those user settings back to the factory default, which is basically just a program mode, you can go in and do that at the reset user settings. The LCD brightness, how bright is the viewfinder in the back? In general, I would leave this at 0, but if you are showing images under bright lights, sunshine for instance, and you want the images to be seen a little bit better, you could pump that up, but I wouldn't leave it at a higher rating all the time because a lot of people are doing their exposure adjustments by simply looking at the back of the camera. Clean image sensor. And so on this setting here, let me double check. Basically, this is where you can clean the sensor right now, and it just does that automatic cleaning. The camera is naturally set to clean at start up and start down, which I think is fine, and you probably won't need to come to this section ever, but you could turn it on and clean it several times in a row. Or you could just turn it on and off several times in a row, and it would do the same thing. You also have mirror, lock mirror up for cleaning. And this is if you want to be a little bit daring and take a sensor swab or other device to get in and actually clean the sensor itself. It's not something I recommend for everyone, but if you're a daring individual and you have careful, steady hands, you can clean the sensor yourself. If not, you can turn it into a repair facility to have them clean it. Video mode. You can go in here and change from NTSC to PAL, depends on what video system you use. Here in North America, we use NTSC. Other parts of the world use PAL. This will also determine what types of shutter speeds or frame rates you can get in the video mode. So whether you're shooting at 24 or 25 frames a second. And then we have an HDMI control, which controls the output resolution and device control. If you have this hooked up to an HD TV, you can control the camera somewhat by the remote of the TV if you have this activated. Flicker reduction, when you're in the live view or the movie mode, the screen refresh rate on the back of the camera may interfere with the lights you're working, so you can adjust for flicker problems. For the time and date, you can go in and set that as well, and that's one of the first things that you want to set on a new camera is to make sure it's set for the time zone and place that you're in, and when you travel to a new location, to change that to your new location. This is not Bluetooth enabled. It does not change automatically. This is something that you need to change yourself. We have the language, so you can choose your own language. Lots of different languages in there. Image comment, you can input different comments and then you can choose to whether you want them attached or not. So you could put your name in, it's copyrighted, this is property of, things like that. You can add that information and it goes with the metadata of any image. Auto image rotation, this is one that you want to leave on. This is the one that'll rotate the image when it comes into the computer, which is an awfully handy thing for shooting verticals and horizontals. You don't have to go in and manually change that around later. Dust off reference photo. If you are in a remote area, you don't have your cleaning tools for cleaning the sensor, the auto clean isn't getting it clean, you can shoot a white piece of paper at f/22. There's instructions in the instruction manual on exactly how to do this. But basically you shoot a white piece of paper at f/22 and the camera will then be able to detect where there is problems on your sensor with dust. And it will then try to shoot around those by basically cloning them out as you shoot. And so I would prefer not to do this if I could clean the sensor myself, but it's an emergency situation for getting away from having dust on all your images in a remote location. And then one of my favorite ones is battery info, and this goes in and gives you very precise information on your battery. How many pictures have you taken? How good is the battery in its current life? How good is it in its overall life? Do you need a replacement battery because it can't hold a charge anymore? And this is something that I would encourage you to add to your My menu, which is something that we're going to get to in just a moment. Wireless transmitter. On this one, it's grayed out on my camera because I don't have a wireless transmitter connected up to my camera, but there would be some controls for that. If you had, I believe it's a WT4 transmitter hooked up to your camera, you could get in where that would send data to a computer. Next up, we have copyright information. This is where you can actually put your copyright information. This is slightly different than comments. You can have both if you want. There's a lot of different settings that you can save in your camera. You know, your custom, your user setting 1 and user setting 2. Well, that might take you 2 or 3 minutes to figure out everything you want. And if you want to take all the settings from this camera and save it and get it, excuse me. If you want to save all the settings off of this camera and transfer them to another camera, you can do that by saving all the settings onto a memory card, putting that memory card in a different camera. So if you have a previous Nikon camera that you have set up the way you like, you can take all those settings and transfer them over here. It's just basically like getting a new computer and transferring all your preferences over. There's control for the GPS unit in here. Not going to spend too much time on that. The virtual horizon, which is kind of a fun little feature on here. And if we can get our camera off to the side on this one, it's got a nice little feature. And this is one of the features that you might add to your My menu, which I say I'm going to talk about in a moment here. Because if you have a problem getting level horizons, this will help you out in getting perfectly level horizons. And it's just a nice little graphic that is easy to work with, very intuitive in my mind. But it is buried a little bit deep in the menu system, in my opinion. Non-CPU lens data. This camera works with a lot of older Nikon lenses that do not have the computer chips, and that's the CPUs. And so you can program, you know, let's say you have an old classic 50mm 1.4 manual lens. You can program the camera to let the camera know that it's got a 50mm 1.4, so that information is written to the metadata of those images. And so if you have different lenses, you can program those lenses in and have that a part of it. So it's great to use with older manual lenses in that regard. Occasionally, cameras will have a problem in focusing. They will have a back focus or front focus. And it's hard to say what the problem is. Sometimes it's the lens, sometimes it's the camera, but some cameras just constantly back focus or front focus on a consistent basis. And on previous cameras, you had to send it back to the manufacturer with your lens for a month to have them recalibrated. Well, if you're good at testing things yourself, you can get in and go in and adjust it yourself here, and you can adjust it in really small increments. So, you know, if you focus on 10 feet and it focuses on 10 feet 1 inch, you can back that off to where it's supposed to be. There is also an iFi card that you can put in here, and if there was one in here, this is where it would show up. Next up is firmware version. You might want to take a look at that right now. The camera that I have has version 1.00, but I know from checking the website out yesterday that the current version is 1.1. And so they've made a few fixes in the firmware, which is the software that is running basically all the operations of the camera. And so the process is to go to Nikon's website, go to their downloads, download the current version, put it onto a memory card, put the memory card in here, and then follow the instructions here in firmware version to update that software. It's free, it doesn't take too long, it's pretty easy to do. And so in general, it's good to have your camera running on the latest software because that is going to be the least buggy of all the options out there. The next setup, or below setup, is the retouch menu. And this is something I'm going to pass by very, very quickly on, because if you use Photoshop, Lightroom, or any other program, you can do it much better, in my opinion, in the computer. But if you play back an image and you hit the OK button right in the middle there, it is automatically going to enter the retouch menu. So anytime you want to take an image and play with it, you can do it in here. Now, a lot of the things that you're going to be doing, as I say, you can do better in Photoshop, Lightroom, or other programs. In this camera, if you don't have access to the computer, you can do it straight in the camera, and in many cases, it takes your image that you're about to manipulate and it makes a copy of that image and works on that copy so that you're not damaging the original image. And there's all sorts of fun things that you can do in here. You can trim an image, you can turn it into black and white, you can change the color, all sorts of filter effects that you can do with it. You can do double exposures with 2 existing images. You can resize it. One of the things that's kind of nice, number 8 up here, is the NEF or raw processing. If you have a raw image, you can turn it into a JPEG in case you want to be able to transfer it a little bit more quickly. And as you can see, there's just a lot of things that you can do to alter an image after the fact. And we got some more things. You even have a fisheye fake lens. You can do a miniature effect, which shows certain parts of the picture out of focus. And you can go into the movie mode and start editing your movie if you want. And then you can do a side-by-side comparison of the images that you've played with and their original image. So let's move on down to the last tab, which is My Menu. And when you get into here, you'll have a couple of options. If you go over to Choose Tab, you'll have the choice between Recent Settings or My Menu. And if you're going to be using this camera on a regular basis, I would probably select My Menu. If you're not going to use the camera often, I would just go with Recent Settings. Basically, what's going to happen is anytime you go to this tab, it's just going to go to the features that you used last. But for a regular user, go to My Menu, and here's where you can start adding in your favorite customized features. So I'm going to go up to Add Items, and I want to find that battery option because I want to be able to test the battery and see the battery. And so I'm going to go into, see if I can find it. I think it was in the Setup menu. And let me go through this and see if I can find it. There it is. Battery info, and I'm going to press OK on that. Battery info, I'm going to press OK again. And now battery info is at the top of my menu. Now there's something else that I would like to add into my menu that I think a lot of people should have in there. If we go back to the custom setting menu, it's going to be in the setup menu. And I'm going to go to the top of the list, and that is Format Memory Card. Oh, cannot be used in my menu. Nikon, why did you do this? Shame on you, Nikon. I want that in my menu. And it won't allow me. Okay, I'll find something else. Let's see. What's an important little thing that might be nice to have in there? Virtual Horizon. There we go. I like that one. So I'm going to add that to my menu. And so now when I go to my menu system and I press that, only the features that I use the most will pop up there. This is all going to be under My Menu, and so you would add items to My Menu. And so I can also rank the items. So right now I have Virtual Horizon and Battery Info. If I want Battery Info as the top item, I can hit OK, select it, move it up to the top of the list and press OK. So you can have, I'm not sure the number that you can have in here, but it's probably good to keep it down to maybe 4, 5, or 6 items. And you can order them the way you want, so that when you go into that tab of your menu, it's just those 4 or 5 things that you use most of the time. And it's a nice feature to have. And so you can add items, you can remove items, you can choose the ranking of them, and then choose which tab by going to My Menu. So that ends our tour of the menu system. So we'll kind of take a break and see if there's any questions on other things in the menu system.
There's always questions, John.
Yes, always questions.
Shasta wanted to know if there was a grid feature.
There is a grid view, and you see, I'm really good at telling you if it's there, but where it is another issue. Let's see if I can find it in the
It's
custom.
in the menu.
In the custom menu, shooting display.
Yeah, maybe the shooting display menu area.
Information. Nope, I failed on that one. Where is it? Is it in the setup? There is a grid mode that you can program in. One of the ways you can do it for like the function button, you can do it in there. One of the other options, if we activate the camera, the above camera, I'll press the info button, and I'll press the info button again, and you'll notice how we can navigate through this setting here. And if I go down to the function button, I can press OK, and I can go to framing grid right here and press OK. And now when I press the function button, now I do have to be looking through the camera like this. And where's my function button? And why is that not working for me? Oh, that's always embarrassing.
Minnie Laura says it's D2 for the grid.
D2, let's go try that. D2, oh, so I did have it right, but I just didn't see it. I went too fast by it. Correct, D2, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Minnie
So
Laura.
let's go ahead and turn that on. And it's in our viewfinder now. So I can't show that live here. Let's see if I go to the live view. Now there's a grid for the viewfinder, and then there's a grid for the live view. In live view, if I put it into live view, ooh, that's a terrible exposure. Let's adjust it so at least it's a decent exposure. And I can activate the grid by pressing the information button and get a grid pattern in there. So just the info button in live view. Live view and other modes are just different on the way certain things are turned on and off. But thank you.
Thanks, John. I just want to let you know that K-Stead said every camera should come with Greengo in the box.
Ooh. Too many gringos.
That's going to be tweeted out. I know it.
I'm waiting to see the tweet come in now. I'm watching Twitter going, is somebody going to tweet that? A question about the virtual horizon.
Yes.
And I did miss part of that myself. So one question did come in from Twitter, and then somebody in the room was asking something that went along with it about, is it visible when looking through the viewfinder or in live view or both?
It is not visible looking through the viewfinder. It's going to be on the back screen.
Okay.
So it's going to be either in live view. There's a slightly different looking one in live view versus non-live view.
Okay. Perfect.
And it does work in vertical as well as horizontal. Let's see if it works upside down. Yeah, it gives you the indicator that it's correctly level there. Nice little device.
Florencia in the chat room had asked why can't they access the retouch menu, and it says it's unavailable with their settings. Someone else had asked, do you have pictures on your card? And they said yes, they have a lot.
Yes, well, it depends, and it may not be able to be available. Let me take a look. Let me make a quick setting. I'm going to change my quality setting to shoot RAW. For this class, I've been shooting JPEGs just because we're here in the class and these aren't serious pictures. But if I shoot a RAW image, I play it back, and then I hit the OK button. You know, there's certain types of pictures that it doesn't want to play with when you get into the retouch menu. And I thought it was the RAW images, but it appears to be accepting that. Sepia. Okay, so I'm not exactly sure why it's not available, but I know it's not available on some types of images. It may have to do with 14-bit or 12-bit images, how they are stored, but it has to do with basically the types of images that are available. And I'm sorry I don't know that one.
Maybe we can ask Mini Laura, see what Mini Laura says in the chat room. It's always surprising what they have to say. Another question from David R. What do the A, B, and L mean in firmware version menu?
A and B firmware versions, that's right. Not something that is clearly talked about. And so L is the last version that was active in the camera. And you can add in, let's say you get version 1.1. You can load version 1.1, but you can still keep 1.0 around in case Nikon finds out that 1.1 is worse than 1.0. You could always switch it back over to the B version. And so what you want to do is you want to have the current version and then the one back from that, just in case they find that this one's really bad and it's going to take them a while to make a fix for that. And then it shows you the last one that was in the camera. You can't get to it, but and this is, I have version 1.002, which is probably one of the ones that was in pre-production.
Okay, great, thank you.
I'm laughing at the tweets. Now every camera should come with a Greengo and a Black Rapid in the box. Hint, hint. What would that person like to win? Maybe.
That's a good one. I like that. I have a question from Gamer Photo Guy. Is there a way to display the exposure meter in live view?
Exposure meter in live view. Let's go ahead and give this a try here. Let's set it up in live view. We'll hit the information button and see what sort of information we can get. Actually, we are in manual exposure, and I can adjust my shutter speeds as we were talking about earlier, and we are simply using the screen itself. So we don't have an indicator, we don't have lines, dials, or circles or anything that we're trying to line up. We're just basically looking at the screen to see if it's bright or dark, which is going to make it very difficult to work with in live view outside. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of people have loops that they will be looking at. There's a number of different hoops out there. I think there's a Zakruder and a Hoodman loop are some of the most popular ones, so that you can magnify and look very, very closely at the frame. And so, yeah, that is a bit of a limitation for shooting movies. Next question.
Okay, do you have some? Okay, I'll keep going.
They're going to argue for a little while, so we all get a break.
No. No arguing here. Okay, Murr had asked, I'm in manual shooting RAW. I assigned function button to grid or horizon, but nothing happens when I press on that button. Why? John has all the answers.
I don't know.
Just give him a second,
too
folks.
many things.
He will answer the
question. I feel
question.
on the spot. I feel like I need to know the answer before they ask.
I mean, you can't necessarily answer these questions in 5 seconds.
Yeah.
It might take you 2 minutes.
It shouldn't have anything to do with the fact that they're shooting RAW. And I'm trying to figure out if there's an easy reason why that would be. Let me just see if I can look through here.
I have an easy question that will come after this, just to give you a break.
Okay. I don't know that one, and we'll move on. I'm
All
sorry.
right, no problem. Okay, well, Rita would like to know
Not
where
perfect.
Rita would like to know where do you go again for the firmware version and instructions.
Firmware version. Well, first off, on your camera, let me turn my camera on. If you go to the setup menu, format memory card, there's a long scrolling, and you can loop the other direction. So if you go one up from the memory card, it's going to go to firmware version. So it's in setup menu. It's at the bottom, or you can loop around through the other direction. Press to the right, and that's your firmware version. Now, to get the new firmware, you go to Nikon.com or NikonUSA.com. You go to their drivers, downloads, something like that, upgrades, and it will basically steer you to the direction of new firmware for this particular camera. And then it will have a long list of instructions and agreements for you to download this software. It will download onto your computer relatively quickly. It's a relatively small file size. You'll drag and drop that onto a memory card that you will plug into the camera and then go back to that firmware version, and it will give you instructions on how to input it at that point.
Thank you.
There's a lot of other stuff to read, and I don't want to go through all the details on that.
Yeah, one of the other chatters shared a link for us already.
Okay,
so
nice, thank you.
We've got a link out there for people to find that information. A question going back to the viewfinder, can the viewfinder show both the ISO and remaining exposures at the same time? I think it sounded like
No,
it's one or the other.
It's one or the other.
Okay.
The standard setup is just to show you the remaining pictures. If you press ISO, it will turn on, and that's not a bad option, but some people like to see the ISO all the time, and that was one of the features that we went by in the menu system that you could customize.
So I have kind of a basic question from Vasu. What's the basic test to be done upon receiving a new D7000 to make sure that everything works as it should?
There's a slide for that.
Yeah, I was waiting for that answer.
So we'll actually go through that here in a moment.
Okay, awesome.